Good evening from Strasbourg, where it's been one of the busiest weeks of the year, culminating, of course, in Jean-Claude Juncker's last State of the Union address. If you missed all the best bits, here it is in case you missed it. Unity, sovereignty, one voice. Jean-Claude Juncker's final State of the Union here in Strasbourg today had a clear theme. The president of the European Commission pleaded for an end to what he called the sorry spectacle of a divided Europe. And he stressed the importance of a united EU. But then hours later, some would argue that arguably the real State of the Union emerged, with MEPs voting to discipline one of their own, as you both were mentioning, by triggering Article 7 against Hungary. And we will get into that story in just a bit. But first, Jean-Claude Juncker's last State of the Union address.
European sovereignty can never be to the detriment of others. Europe is a continent of openness and tolerance. It will remain so. Europe will never be a fortress, turning its back on the world or those suffering within it. Europe is not an island. I call on the Council Presidency to now make the decisive step to broker a sustainable solution on migration reform.
We also ask the British government to understand that someone who leaves the Union cannot be in the same privileged position as a member state. If you leave the Union, you are, of course, no longer part of our single market. The
Commission will resist all attacks on the rule of law. We continue to be very concerned by the developments in some of our member states. Article 7 must be applied whenever the rule of law is threatened.
Well, the State of the Union address also included some key announcements. Juncker called for a new partnership with Africa that would see 10 million jobs created in 5 years. He also promised new rules to protect elections from external manipulation. And he also took aim at plastics, calling for a new anti-plastics law. He called for a clock changing as well, saying that member states decide whether to live in summer or winter time. All right, well, let's discuss what Jean-Claude Juncker said today. Ryan, we were talking before the program started, and you had your opinion on the whole speech, in fact. What do you think?
I think it was haphazard. I didn't see a lot of energy. There are some nice sentiments in that speech, but if you compare Juncker and how he defends Europe with his spokesperson, Margarita Schinas, will come on with a lot more energy in a few minutes and defend him compared to what Juncker was saying today, or other people who are passionate about the project. He felt very flat today, like you were giving a history lesson rather than really going in with a political punch.
Yeah, so, just with insight, because you used to be a speechwriter. How does that happen if a speech like this comes out?
It's a really difficult process. So when I wrote one of these State of the Union speeches, 17 drafts before a president even looked at it. It's a mess. There are lots of people that want to have input. So you really need a president who's going to take control and put a lot of thinking in advance. And I think some of the ideas in the speech, the border police, the partnership with Africa, these are great ideas. They would have been a lot better if they were happening 3 years ago. It's not like the migration crisis is a new thing. It's not like we didn't know that governments and the EU needed to be in control of Europe's borders.
Maricha, what stood out for you in that entire speech?
Well, I agree it was haphazard. It was really jumping between topics, but I was really sitting at the tip of my seat when Jean-Claude Juncker started talking about Syria. We are really witnessing a looming bloodbath in Idlib, and he said we cannot be bystanders. And I fundamentally agree. Europe cannot be a bystander when these terrible events are bound to happen, and we need to intervene, but then nothing came. And so I think it really underlines the fact that we are not strong enough of a global player, that we do not have our defense cooperation in order. And so I thought it was challenging to see where there was agendas and where there were assessments of actual weak points that we urgently need to fix.
The speech might not have had the punch you were talking about, but then we had some reactions from MEPs in the chamber, so let's take a look.
Is the European Union in a better shape now than it was when you took office? And I think the answer is clear. No. There has never been a time in the history of European integration where Europe was more disunited than it is now.
My proposal is, Jean-Claude, be ambitious. You have said, and that will be my conclusion, that this was in fact the Commission of the last chance. You remember that, 4 years ago. And I'm always asking myself, what can come after the Commission of the last chance in the coming years? So I think what will come is something different. The Commission that we need in the future, dear colleagues, will be more than that. It will be a type of a new, renewed European government, what we need.
Well, Mr. Juncker, what a picture you paint. A European Union of peace, of prosperity, of contentedness. And as you said, you're trying to make it a little more perfect every day. Well, it's a very good advertising slogan, but tell you what surprised me. Since your last State of the Union speech, there's been a seismic political event in Europe, perhaps one even on a par with Brexit. Italy, a founding member of the Union, the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, now has a coalition government between the Five Stars and Malega that is polling over 60% of the vote and is posing a direct challenge, both in terms of the management of the Eurozone and indeed how the migration crisis is handled. You made no acknowledgement of that at all. No acknowledgement of the populist revolt. I noted your continued use of the phrase sovereign Europe. What you're talking about is a deeper centralisation of power.
So there we have it. I mean, very interesting discussions in what MEPs are saying. Do you think that the criticism is fair? I'll put it to you, Marietje, as an MEP, that he's in denial, Jean-Claude Juncker, about what has actually been achieved?
Well, I do think that this is very much a policy speech that doesn't necessarily resonate with the average European. And I think that is the task ahead of us. We have an election year coming up, and I think it is crucial that also members of European Parliament that may want to be re-elected will go out there and show that Europe adds value, can come up with solutions that are close to people, and give Europe color for people, not in technicalities, not in budget lines, but really in solutions that matter for people and that can take some of the concerns away. Because I think if we look at Europe today, we see a lot of challenges, and part of the population thinks that Europe is part of the problem, and another part can see Europe as part of the solution. And so it is crucial that we can make that link to people everywhere in Europe that are not used to talking in policy terms or in speech words. And that, I do believe, is a challenge for all of us. And that didn't really come across. With the lack of energy, it wasn't really visionary, it wasn't really touching the heart. It was rather a list of talking points.
Yes, so because some of the people that we had on the panel in the past couple of days were saying that what Europe needs now is vision.
Yeah.
And we did see that, did we?
No, and it doesn't have to be a big, huge general vision. He could have looked the camera straight down the barrel and said to the people of Italy who might be doubting the EU, here's 3 reasons why you shouldn't give up on the EU. And here's one thing that I'm going to do in the next 12 months, my final 12 months, to make sure you can still believe in Europe like I believe in Europe. And I just didn't feel that come across at all.
Right, and speaking of opinions, as you both were raising, our team in the Cube in Lyon have been looking into this. Let's cross over to them. What do you have for us?
Hello to you, Tessa. Well, obviously, everyone looking at the elder statesman of Europe, as some people see Jean-Claude Juncker. But what about the young voices of Europe? What about the next generation of Europeans? What do they have to say? Well, here in the Cube, we've been reaching out to a lot of young people from the European Youth Forum. Now, they're obviously, as you can imagine, quite engaged in wanting to debate about the future of Europe. And they were really keenly watching this speech. Let's just bring you up some of what they had to say here. This is Karina. She's 28 years old, and she's from Austria. Now, for her, Jean-Claude Juncker touched on youth unemployment, which was a key issue. But for her view, anyway, it didn't go far enough. Let's hear what she had to say.
The European Union is slowly recovering from the financial crisis. Youth unemployment might be lower than it was some years ago. But we also need to ensure that young people have quality jobs and also have access to social rights and that their social rights are protected.
So an idea here that, yes, Jean-Claude Juncker might have touched upon it, but he didn't go far enough in actually dealing with it. I think we're hearing that from the panel discussion there. Well, there's Andre here in Belgium, and for him it was climate change, talking about it, but what was the action? Let's see what he had to say.
In the State of the European Union, Juncker talked a lot about climate change. He talked a lot, but he didn't promise any action, and action is what we young people need. Because if we're not doing it now, the problems are only getting worse, and future generations need to deal with it.
Let me just finally end with you on Kristen here. Now, Kristen, she is 25. She's from Estonia. And for her, the future of Europe is about getting young people elected and more involved in that way. Let's hear what she had to say.
President Juncker called for next year to be a landmark for democracy. This can only happen if all citizens are equally part of this process and barriers to young people's participation are removed. Political parties need to give real electable positions to young candidates, and candidates and parties in their programs need to speak about issues that matter to young voters.
So that's just a flavour of what some young people are saying in Estonia, in Austria, in Belgium. But Tesa, as you're saying there's a lot of opinions going around. And I think a lot of people feel Jean-Claude Juncker delivered a speech that didn't really offer much in the way of substance that they wanted to hear.
All right, thank you for that, Alex and our CUBE team. Well, joining me now, someone who knows a lot about communicating the Commission's message to Europeans, Margaritis Skinas, the chief spokesperson for the EU Commission, and also with us, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor here at Euronews. I will begin with you, Margaritis. I mean, the young people were saying that, well, you know what, Europe is not actually talking to us or doing something for us, anything for us. What do you think?
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that Europe is a diverse entity of 28 member states, of almost 500 million people. You cannot talk to everybody at the same time with the same message. What was important today, I think, in the President's speech is that he struck the right balance between a rather pragmatic assessment of the political and economic situation around us in Europe, but also a quite punchy, visionary view of what is to come in the next 14 months of this Commission. I think he struck the right balance. It was a very Junckerite speech, if I may. It was Juncker himself speaking. And I think the overwhelming reactions that we saw, both here in the European Parliament, in the national capitals and across Europe, are very encouraging.
We just heard our guest earlier who was saying actually it wasn't that punchy and there wasn't a lot of vision. And so how do you say that is actually communicating to Europeans?
I just happened to see that there was an overwhelming positive reception from heads of state and government across the European...
Well, heads of state, but not your voters, your citizens, the young people.
I have seen in the European Parliament the presidents of all major pro-European groups saluting the approach of the president. Of course, Ryan and few journalists will never be happy with what we produce at the Commission, but I think the overall reception was good. And probably what
Darren.
How dare you? We'd never be happy. I think Margarita's point about the balance, and it was a balanced speech, is part of the problem. So you've got people like Guy Verhofstadt saying it was not ambitious enough, he wants more ambition. For people like Nigel Farage and Eurosceptics, it goes too far. And that is the fundamental problem in many ways where the European Union finds itself. Europe's facing many big issues at the moment. Big issues like migration, big issues such as the rise of populism and the far right. And for voters are falling into two camps. Those that think that Europe is the answer, and a growing number of people who think that Europe is part of the problem. And the problem is that in that speech, there was no real addressal to the people who feel that Europe is increasingly part of the problem. There was a kind of sense of denial that is happening.
I beg to disagree with that, Tesa, if you allow me, because what President Juncker put forward today was not an abstract, empty vision. It was full of meat. There was lots of specific policy proposals. There was lots about the Europe that protects, about external borders, about putting together our resources where our problems are, about buying an insurance contract against those who want to interfere in the European elections of next year. Concrete proposals on cybersecurity, subsidiarity, a new deal for Africa. These are major policy proposals.
But not in a way that would...
Yeah, I think in the sense that, in the grand scheme of things, that, this speech was not going to change your impression of the European Union.
But Darren, you must have had your impression because...
We did. And I managed to grab a short while with Jean-Claude Juncker at lunchtime. And this is what he had to say in a very brief interview. Let's have a look.
4 years ago, you stood up and said you wanted to be frank, that Europe was not in a good state. Surely 4 years later, under your stewardship, it's got worse.
No, that's the way some of our British colleagues in Parliament are presenting things. I don't think that things have developed in a bad direction. We have growth, 21 trimester following one the other. The unemployment has gone down, the budgetary deficit went down, investment is at a level where it was during the crisis. So I don't share the view of those who are saying that everything is dark. There is sunshine somewhere.
There are problems though, migration, Brexit, populism.
Yes, but...
Aren't you in denial a little bit?
No, not at all. I'm not naive. I know exactly where the problems do exist. Populism is a problem. Brexit is a disaster, and the fact that member states were unable to agree on the basic answers to be given to the migration problem is making me sad. That's not the Commission, because the Commission made its proposals in March 2015. If member states, all of the member states, would have been as wise as the Commission was 4 years ago, things would have developed in a different way.
On Brexit, there's talk from Michel Barnier, from others in Britain, that a deal can be done in 6 to 8 weeks. Do you think a deal will be done?
I share the views of Michel Barnier.
And one final question, in one word, what's your biggest regret of your presidency?
The fact that the European institutions were unable to bridge the differences between East and West.
All right, Darren, what was your main takeaway from that?
I think it's interesting. We heard this in the speech as well. It's like potential passing of the buck, or a recognition at least of reality, that the Commission can't be blamed for everything, and that Jean-Claude Juncker can't be blamed for all the problems in the European Union. Okay, we'll make that fair point. But isn't that also part of the problem? That this is a union made of lots of countries, but also lots of institutions, and that whoever is president, their hands are constantly tied.
Well, but this is what the European Union is all about. This is not Washington, this is Brussels. We have a division of power where decision-making authorities shared between institutions and the capitals. I'm aware that there are many expectations bestowed upon the Commission emerging as a system that can decide to do and undo things, but reality, institutional reality, is much more complex than that. We have proposals to defend, we have MEPs to convince, we have capitals to win over. So I understand this, at times it's a mixture of self-flagellation and increased expectations, but that's life around us.
It is, and that's democracy to a degree, but it's also the Achilles heel of the European Union. Ryan was talking earlier on about migration. This is something potentially that should have been in place 3 years ago, not now. And that I think is what Europeans are crying out for. They want solution to these big problems, and the European Union might be able to provide them, but it will be years down the line simply because no one institution can ever take the lead at any one time.
If you allow me a comment on this 3 years ago thing. 3 years ago, we laid the groundwork for an EU migration policy that worked. We have saved 700,000 people in the Mediterranean. We have reduced the flows by 94% in the Aegean and 80% in the central Mediterranean. We have a system of hotspots that can distinguish asylum seekers from those that need to be returned. All this is there.
But you've also seen a massive increase in public opinion against migration, and people who think it's being mishandled.
Yes, because the people who think it's being mishandled are misinformed by certain national governments that they want to Europeanize failure and nationalize success. Okay. And this is costing us.
Margaritis, you worked really closely with Jean-Claude Juncker. In one word, how would you describe his legacy? One word.
One word. Mr. Europe working for the common interest
of all. That's a lot of words. All right,
it's quite difficult.
Indeed.
We'll give him that.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Now, let's move on. An unlikely bromance seems to be burgeoning in the chamber of the European Parliament, but it looks like it might be a case of unrequited love. Let's take a look at today's Power Play. Well, that was fun.
Well, Nigel Farage told me afterwards that it was Union Jack socks.
Right.
He'd been wearing them a few months ago, that Jean-Claude Juncker had admired them, and so his leaving present...
Just tell us a behind-the-scene context. I mean, he didn't want it?
We haven't opened the box yet.
Okay, well, now you know what's in it.
Now I will talk
to
Natasha Berthaud, who gets the box, and she will tell me, I'm sure.
My name is Gunnar Hökmark. Nicola Danti from Italy, Socialist and Democrat Party.
Teresa Jimenez Becerril. I'm from the EPP Party.
Laura Ferrara from Five Star Movement. Martina Werner, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschland.
What is the real state of the European Union in one word?
Stable.
Lack of union.
Not so good.
Not strong enough.
What is the biggest success of the European Union?
Peace and freedom.
The enlargement. The vote against Hungary.
Improvement in economic.
I don't know.
What is the biggest failure?
The lack of participation of citizens.
Immigration.
Not to speak with one voice in all issues.
Not having fulfilled all the reforms. Too much failure.
Viktor Orban in one word.
Too nationalist.
Beyond the borders of our values. Dictator.
Bad.
Now, this is supposed to be Jean-Claude Juncker's day in the spotlight, his State of the Union address. But perhaps more revealing than anything he had to say is the vote that came just a few hours later. MEPs triggered Article 7, the so-called nuclear option against Hungary. The measure required a two-thirds majority to pass, and it did pass. 448 voted in favor, 197 against, and 48 abstained. Now, Article 7 can lead to a country losing its voting rights if it is deemed to have let democracy or human rights slide. The author of the report, Judith Sargentini, was visibly moved by the result, but Orban's populist allies will be less than pleased. Well, with me to get a handle on what this vote will mean for the EU, Hungary, and Viktor Orban is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. And also joining us for this panel is Jan Zahardil, a Czech MEP who's a member of the European Conservatives and Reformist Group. Jan, I'll start with you. How did you vote and why?
I voted against Hungary to be sanctioned, so I voted against the resolution that would advise to trigger this Article 7 against Hungary. The reason is very obvious. I'm coming from the Czech Republic, Central European country. We have certain, I would say, V4, Visegrad 4 solidarity amongst us. We did a lot of things in common, and I do not believe that this is the right way how to treat a country. Although I could admit that there might be some particular problems, I do not believe that this is the right way how to start a dialogue.
Okay, so do you acknowledge the accusations against Viktor Orban and the way his government is handling democracy and human rights in his country?
Well, I read those accusations. I have to say that when it comes to report of Madame Sargentini, I believe that this was very much influenced by her political affiliation, and I believe that Hungary is a democratic country. It has a democratic elected government. It has a constitution. It has all, international treaties, and it abides to them. So I think that this was pretty inappropriate to vote this way, and it was a kind of rather political punishment, I would say.
Okay, isn't that the point, though, that that's what necessarily the Russians or Vladimir Putin would say, is that we've got democracy, it's just not democracy how you see it. And clearly, the vast majority of MEPs believe that Viktor Orban is breaking the fundamental principles of the European Union.
Yeah, they believe that. I don't believe that, and I definitely would not compare Mr. Orban to Mr. Putin in any way. I think that in Russia we can talk really about a very limited state of democracy. I definitely believe that Hungary is not the case.
But you look at that speech he made yesterday, when he could have been conciliatory, when he could have at least mooted the possibility of compromise, and there was none of that. It was a very defiant tone. It was kind of sticking two fingers up and saying, I'm not going to change. That's not what politics is about. That's not what the European Union is about, surely.
Look, every politician has his own style. Mr. Orban is a fighter. He's a strong man. He understands politics this way. So it is his way how to communicate, and it was his way how to defend. Whether it had some impact on today's vote or not, I can hardly guess.
But this is clearly a message from the vast majority of MEPs that we saw about what Hungary is doing. So it's a message again. But in reality, legally speaking, are they really going to lose their voting rights?
Almost certainly not. It would be extraordinary if they did, not least of all because this is only the start of a process. It's a three-stage process. And at the end, they need essentially all the remaining EU 27 nations to support this. And I would suspect there are one or two in Eastern Europe who won't, not least of all Poland, for example.
Even more.
Maybe even more. And so I think it is incredibly unlikely that sanctions will be in place. That is not to say that clearly Hungary have taken this very seriously. The European Union have taken this very seriously. And it is a very, very strong message. And it is interesting that the Hungarian Foreign Minister tonight, and indeed some MEPs, are suggesting that essentially it was rigged because, of course, the absentee votes in that parliamentary vote were not included.
Strasbourg isn't exactly known as a hub for international musicians and artists, but today it's a little different. These musicians are all here for one reason, a debate over whether to update 17-year-old copyright laws and a vote tomorrow. Now, the issue has split musicians and pitted some against web giants like Google, who would be obliged to filter uploaded content for copyright violations and pay to publish or even link to content they don't own. Now, those against the reform say that it would mean the end of an open web and transform it into a giant snooping tool, while those in favor say artists are losing profits and their livelihoods. Well, believe it or not, this copyright vote has drawn in a Haitian rapper and a former Fuji Wyclef Jean. He's in Strasbourg for a concert in the parliament tonight, and he has appealed to MEPs to embrace and improve the internet rather than attempt to block and hinder it. And here's what he told Raw Politics a little earlier.
My side first was, look, you download a Wyclef, I need to get my money for it, But what happened is, it's a new generation and it's a new era. And what I'm watching is the amount of success that comes when you just leave the information open. So take a Wyclef song like Maria Maria. I own the copyright, right? Then DJ Khaled, Rihanna does it. It becomes Wild Thoughts. Then 100,000 kids want to just do their own version of Maria Maria. Why would I not let them do that?
But you are already Wyclef Jean. You have a name. Not everybody will be able to gather that kind of attention just by putting something online for free.
Are you ready for this? So if you look statistically, right, the kids that are starting off as independent artists, right, and I use this, what are we working with? 0 to 0. I gave the example of me selling CDs from the back of my trunk to get what? Exposure and to get access. So the part which I was saying earlier is there's so much tools that kids could use. We could see it through 6ix9ine. I could tell you 50 to 60 different kids that were nobody and that learned how to use the internet tools and now that are turning that around. So I think if you saw earlier, I said there needs to probably be a new platform to explain to kids that are starting off, which I'll give you an example. I just signed these girls called the Isaac Sisters. And once again, they're new artists. How did I find them? I found them through the access of them doing covers of other people's songs.
But you see, for every success story, there are a lot of other struggling musicians who have the opposite opinion of you. They are for the copyright law to protect their content that they create. Do you not? You were once a struggling artist, weren't you? Do you not sympathize with their point of view?
Of course, I'm representing for the struggling artists, right? Because at the end of the day, right, when a struggling artist is starting out, right, I'm using myself. When I started out, the first thing that I needed was not to protect my copyright law. It was access. I needed somebody to hear me. That was the first thing that I need. So the first thing that you need as an independent artist, right, is the ability to have access so that people can hear you. Because look at this, right? Watch this. If an artist, right, that's a young Wyclef right now, right, he does Someone Please Call 911, right, and he gives it for free, right? And he doesn't protect it, right? He gives it for free, but you are aware he still owns his copyright, right? Sure. Now he gives it for free. You out of nowhere, you sing Someone Please Call 911. Me as an agency, I realized that, holy crap, this is Wyclef And all of a sudden, this kid can make so much money from the
But very quickly, I want to ask you, because Sir Paul McCartney, you know, he's a successful artist as well. He's on the other side. He doesn't share your opinion. He says this is cheating people out of their earnings.
Yes. So once again, right? No, I'm on the other side. The side that I'm on is I'm watching it real time, right? Every artist that I've worked with, I've given an example, like Fuse.
You don't think he has a point?
Of course, we both have points. Now I'm giving you my point. I'm going to take an artist that was on tour, right? That opened up for me, called Fuse, right? After we go to after party and they're like, yo, Clef, Clef, we need you to do a verse. I do a verse. Next day, they're like, Clef, we need you to do the video before you leave. Before I land, this song is on YouTube, right? Listen, now they blow up, and after they blow up, they go back to Ghana. They create foundations, they do all that. So when you're saying for every negative, there's a success story, right? At the end of the day, I'm not saying that the artist's copyright is not supposed to be protected. I didn't say that at all.
So what are you saying?
I'm saying that as an artist, you have to give freedom of range so that people can use the material, right? Could be able to share it. Because if you do not share, you lose access. And if you, because you're saying struggling artists, right? So when we were starting, the most important thing for any artist that's starting out, access. Okay. You need freedom of access.
Now, this morning, we saw the world react to the Me Too movement's latest casualty. The head of the U.S. media giant CBS, Les Moonves, he resigned over allegations of sexual misconduct. Now, here at the Parliament, that subject continues to be a very sensitive one. At a plenary session in October last year, things got pretty explosive. Brandishing Me Too signs, MEPs blasted the Parliament for not doing enough to fight for change and dealing with sexual harassment both inside and outside the institutions. Now, one complaint took 17 months to process, prompting the creation of a harassment committee. But critics say there's still a long way to go. Now, the issue is back on the agenda tonight here in Strasbourg, and I'm joined by two people who know this very well. Linnea Engström, a Swedish Green MEP. You are sitting also on the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And you have Jeanne Ponte. You were the first one, you're a parliamentary assistant, and you're the first one to put your name on, allegations of sexual harassment. Now, this is really a very sensitive topic, especially here at the European Parliament. So I'll start with you, Jeanne.
Yeah.
What gave you, was it hard to put your name to say, I've been sexually harassed here?
I will not say it was easy first, of course, but I got the support of a lot of my colleagues, and also I realized suddenly that I was not the only one, obviously, because it's something that is quite that we can see quite often here, but within all the European institutions. Of course, it's not properly happening within the European Parliament. We will be really lucky if sexual harassment was only inside this house. But I've started getting a lot of testimonies from my colleagues, and the two, I think my aim was first to not get used to sexual harassment, because I think often some of the victims of sexual harassment, either men or either women, they can be resignated and say, okay, maybe it's happening every day and it happens to me like it happens to my colleagues. So politicians are like that. So the first
when it gets normalized, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, Linnea, I will ask you that. Is it normalized here as an MEP? Do you see this all the time among fellow MEPs, or what is the feeling, and is there political will?
Yes, I think it's normalized. I don't see it regularly, but I was a bit shocked coming here as a new MEP. Now for years, but I think in the beginning, because my experience was the first 6 months when you're new, you don't know anyone, you're trying to find your role, and then I was sort of struck by how sort of common it was. And it's of course about the hierarchy here, about power relations between men and women and between older and younger. assistants, MEPs, and I would say that there is a very, very low political will to tackle these things.
Why is there no will? We saw a worldwide movement.
Because this is a male-dominated arena, and most of the people here are older men. They've had a long political career. They just see them as being nice to you.
Yeah.
You know, don't be, intimidated. I was
Yeah.
just hugging you because you're so nice. And they don't understand that this is like a violation of your private space.
Yeah.
So we did speak to another MEP, Tesa, and she, this is what she told us earlier.
Well, last year when we adopted the resolution, it was very clearly stated that we wanted mandatory trainings also for members of this parliament, because we believe it's important, to see what can be harassing behavior for MEPs and how they should deal with it, because they are very often the people who are in power and who should know about the situation. And unfortunately, in the action plan that we have seen now, this training is not mandatory for members of the parliament, but only for staff. And I think this creates an additional problem, because then it kind of looks like as if the blame is to be put on the staff and that they need to be trained and not the members who are actually the ones who are in power. So I believe that this is something that still needs to be discussed, and I hope that we can change it and have mandatory training for MEPs as well.
So Tesa Reintke, she was one of the MEPs holding those signs, the sign "Me Too" at the plenary session, and she's campaigning for change within Parliament as you are. This shining a spotlight on the fact that you have to teach assistants and staff how to behave and not MEPs.
That's terrible. That's really, really, really terrible, because it's also putting the responsibility of sexual harassment on the shoulders of the parliamentary assistant, for example. And it's also suspicious, because why training staff and not the members of the European Parliament? And just like to come back to some things, just let's not forget that it's really hard to define sexual harassment in your daily lives when you have always someone telling you, for example, you don't understand jokes, or you don't understand this is just seduction.
We are here in we make laws here. The laws are made, structures are put. So what structure should be in place to prevent this, interpretation to be getting through?
I think you need a procedure, and I think it's all about like how the workplace.
There is one here, right? But is it working?
Yeah, but
that's not working well, because what we've seen is that there is only 11 cases of harassment, and none of them is about sexual harassment. Obviously, it's not because it does not exist. It's because the woman or the main victim of sexual harassment, they don't have the input and they don't have the trust in just speaking to a body, of institutional body. So this is why, like, the first thing we ask both is the mandatory training for everyone, but also the recomposition of the committee dealing with harassment, because this is not possible to have in this committee member of the European Parliament. It should be like doctor or therapist. Sure. Because even if you act in goodwill, you're not a therapist to receive
so
like
can
the first
MEPs, because
testimonies.
can MEPs actually be, can it be made mandatory for MEPs as an MEP?
Why
can
not?
That happen?
Why shouldn't it?
So why isn't it?
Every political group should have their action plan to tackle sexual harassment. And what we need is the discussion, like the awareness raising of how this is played out in a political room, for example. I mean, maybe I experienced sexual harassment, but also sexism, so that you are, in a situation, a vulnerable situation, where people are just attributing some special features for you, just because you're young, just because you're a woman, and that's also kind of, affecting your possibility to act politically.
Since this, as you both said, that this is a male-dominated place. I mean, the men have responsibilities too. I mean, the other hashtag in the plenary session in October was "our responsibility," I believe. So how's that? Where's the position of male members of parliament here?
I think it's very weak. I mean, I'm Swedish, and I think it's starting to bubble, like this kind of male consciousness about after the Me Too movement. I've seen many men like organizing themselves to address these issues, because of course it's about masculinity, but I think we're very, very far behind in this house. It's a kind of role that you play when you're a politician, to be this kind of man or whatever.
In 2013, the ombudsman lashed out against the European Parliament over a specific case that took a very long time to have action. So should cases be taken outside of the European Parliament for anything to change?
also, just let's not forget that the fact that what exists within the European Parliament
an example. It's a microcosm, obviously, of
if you're a victim and if you want to formally complain, you go to the police directly, and that is like the criminal law, of course. But I think the priority is just to have like the right person at the right moment, and also getting the information. What is your right as the worker of the European Parliament? So this is why we coordinated a group of workers of the European Parliament, making the access to the information about your rights and the existing bodies if you want to formally complain, because that's the first difficulty.
Strasbourg Week is also known as the traveling circus. Now, this is a favorite target of Eurosceptics. And when you consider just what it takes to pick up and move here from Brussels, it's not difficult to see why.
Once a month, sometimes twice, the train from Brussels pulls in the station, and with it 751 MEPs and their 3,500 support staff and 2,500 trunks containing tens of thousands of documents. The cost, 180 million euros a year, 19,000 tons of CO2 emissions, and don't forget the 317 days a year when all these buildings stand empty, wasting energy.
Well, that's it from Strasbourg. Thanks for watching. We'll be heading for the train. We'll be back in Brussels every weeknight at 6 p.m. CET, 5 p.m. in the UK. Don't forget to join us then.